Hi, everyone. Today we have Matt Krisiloff, who is the founder and CEO of Ovid Research and also the founder of SciFounder, which is the subject of today's conversation. So this is a podcast that's really oriented for scientists who are looking to start companies or who have already started a company. And SciFounder has a pretty unique set of resources to offer early stage or aspiring scientists entrepreneurs. So with that out of the way, Matt, welcome to the podcast. And would you want to tell us a little bit about SciFounder to start us off?
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, happy to be here. And that sounds great. So SciFounders, and specifically SciFounder Fellowship, is a program I and a couple other people started to help early career scientists start companies. It was really born out of a thesis that one of the biggest advancements, so to speak, that have happened in the last 15 years roughly is in the software world. There's a lot more software engineers that are actually starting the most interesting companies and building those companies into the long term in a much more impactful way than, say, when the professional business people or later career executives are coming in from the start and kind of running things with more of a financialization mindset. We often, I guess background on me too, like I used to work at Y Combinator, and I really noticed this phenomenon that often these more product oriented technology building founders cared more about the fundamental technology they were building than just the business aspects and just the financial return. And I think that ultimately led to better outcomes, both in technological translation, but also even if the thing you care about counterintuitively is the financial outcome, having someone that's more comfortable going for the longer term, bolder outcomes ends up being really, really valuable. So I think that transformation has happened very significantly in that world, in that software world. But when it comes more to scientists, be it life scientists or even beyond, I don't think that same type of idea has percolated properly. I think far too often it's still this model, which often does work really well, but a model where it's more of this top-down approach where venture capitalists or former pharma executives are kind of starting companies, heavily capitalizing them, bringing in very veteran executives. I think we've seen a lot of great companies form from that now, but I'm a strong believer there's other types of companies that could get started kind of bottom up, where it's the scientists really running things and building up more momentum over time. And potentially even having stronger translational outcomes, just like in that software example. So that's what we wanted to nurture more of, have more examples of scientist founders that are actually very promising leaders and company builders that can both develop the technologies they're already working on and the research they're working on, but also serve as an important example for other scientists out there that this type of pathway is possible.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I've written posts on this in the past too, that there are kind of no restrictions really on who can be a good biotech founder, but we just happen to be in a world where most of the biotech companies are started by people who've been in the industry for a while, which is great. And there's obviously a ton of great companies that come out of that. But there's also a lot of examples of younger and more technical founders starting really lasting companies, Genentech being the canonical example of that. And until recently, that's definitely been underrepresented in the market. And there's been a little bit more of that over the last few years, but it still feels like there's still a lot more that could be done in terms of helping scientists start companies and providing them with resources. So what do you think, like from what you've seen, like there has been more funding of young entrepreneurs. What do you think is kind of missing, either in expanding the number of companies that are funded, the number of scientists who can start companies or feel comfortable doing so, or kind of helping them get going once they've gotten the first round of investment in?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think this is why we're focusing more on this area, but the biggest thing is getting people to start even in the first place, to really believe this is a possibility and it's what they want to focus on. I think, especially when you think about the earlier career scientists, they're looking at this pathway often of whether they've expected to go, many of them into academia, a 10-year professorship track, and it can be hard to kind of break that model in terms of thinking, what are the other types of alternate pathways out there that for what they're doing may or may not be more impactful than the type of pathway they had already for themselves assumed they were going to set out on. So I think changing that idea there is really important. I don't think there's enough interesting companies that are currently being pursued right now compared to what could be possible and the types of outcomes that could come from those types of companies existing. So changing the narrative there, and I think as well changing the narrative around more scientists wanting to work at these types of companies as well, not just found them, but support these startups, like be part of a team that's going after really ambitious research for translation. I think that's really important as well. I think over time we need to see both more people generally going into sciences, but then also people already into a science pathway, considering alternatives to just the more traditional tracks.
Yeah, and I think one thing you said there I found pretty interesting is that the impact relative to um, some of the things that you could work on in more traditional scientific career paths, can obviously have a lot of impact, especially at an early stage research level. But there's a different kind of impact available if you work at a company. And we want to elaborate on that a little bit more. But I think before we get too far in the interview, you should talk a little bit about your background and the rest of your team as SciFounder. So basically, SciFounder, you guys are funding early stage scientists to help start companies, and then the team is you and Nish and Trevor. Is that right?
No, so Lucas Harrington from
Lucas. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and then Alex Schubert is part of our team as well. So yeah, background on everyone. So me, like Richard said at the start, CEO of this company, Ovid Research. We're working on turning pluripotent stem cells into human eggs for fertility purposes. It's a company that's been operating for about 3 years now. Roughly 15 scientists full-time, some part-time people as well. And yeah, it's a very research-oriented company. I myself am not a scientist. I kind of happenstance ended up in much more of like a research technology type of mindset over years prior to even starting the company. I used to run Y Combinator's research nonprofit that would fund all sorts of interesting scientific research. And prior to that, I worked at the core for-profit Y Combinator. Also prior to SciFounder, I had a different venture fund entity that was much more of a traditional venture fund than kind of SciFounders is now. But yeah, in terms of Ovid, have 2 scientists, co-founders. They're both reproductive biologists, PhDs. I think together we make a really, really effective team. I think they bore out the examples that scientists can make really great leaders and really great company founders. I'm very proud of the progress we've been able to make thus far in that front. In terms of the rest of the SciFounder team, so yeah, Lucas Harrington is one of the co-founders of Mammoth Biosciences. This is a company that spun out of Jennifer Doudna's lab at UC Berkeley. As well, it's a great example where it's a couple former graduate students that once they finished their graduate work, started this company and are continuing to run the company to this day. Things are still early, but it's had a very promising trajectory so far. Very significant funding raise, a good sized team at this point, and working on really interesting research around applied research around discovering novel CRISPR systems and developing them for therapeutic and diagnostic purposes. Nish Bhatt is on our team as well. He's one of the co-founders of Color Genomics, which has been a pretty successful population genomics company, raised a couple $100 million. One of his co-founders was Elad Gil, who is pretty famous in Silicon Valley world as a investor and company founder. And then, yeah, rounding out the team is Alex Schubert, who is full-time on the program. He did his PhD at Cambridge and then worked at Genentech for a couple years before coming to start this program with us. So yeah, one of the things about what we've done is I think we have a very effective team of people that are in this position of being early career founders, doing life science companies. And unlike a lot of the investors out there in Silicon Valley that are more and more willing to fund these early career scientists, we actually are not only just willing to do that, but we also have the experience of this early company building around these very different types of companies compared to the software companies most of the investors out here have experience in. Obviously, Boston class of VCs, they have a lot of experience, tremendous amount of experience as well. But yeah, they're often less inclined to be doing this early stage bottoms up model compared to the top down model I was describing earlier. So yeah, we think we're, hopefully doing something that's pretty helpful for the teams we're working with and even beyond in terms of creating more educational resources to help scientists understand how to do something that's so different and is, relatively difficult.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things about what you guys are doing are that, so Nish has built a company and you and Lucas are actively building companies right now. So this is something you're doing in addition to being CEO and CSO of your respective companies. And I guess amongst the other sort of groups like yours that provide kind of the first round or early capital to scientific founders, I don't know if there's any others that are run by people who are actually also running biotech startups. So that puts you guys in a pretty unique position where you're not only can relate to the sort of emotional issues that founders go through, you also kind of see the science on a day-to-day basis, which a lot of other investors may not be familiar with if they're kind of newer to the biotech space. And then you're also able to share your networks of investors, which you've developed as founders, with the people who go through your program. So I think that's a very cool and pretty unique aspect of what you guys offer.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that type of thing's very common in the software world, but much less so in the life science world, which is, again, part of why we wanted to plug that hole, so to speak. And that's not to say, we're going to understand everything going on with every type of idea. I think kind of the idea landscape of what people are working on and the depth of people's research can be pretty wide in life sciences broadly. So I think it gives us a step up in a lot of ways, but yeah, I mean, there's still just, I don't want to kid where, different people are going to be working on different things. And so certain aspects of it might be harder to be as helpful on, but I think compared to most people, we can go a lot broader in a very helpful way.
Yep. And this is not your first go around. You guys already did one batch, right? Earlier this year or last year?
So we funded 5 teams at the beginning of the year. We're planning to fund another 5 to 8 with this application cycle. The application deadline being August 15th.
Okay, yeah, let's quickly maybe talk about the kind of what you guys offer and the application deadline to get that out of the way, and then we can talk about some of the other more interesting stuff.
Yeah, sounds good. So we are giving teams $400,000 that we select. We have a written application process online on our website, SciFounders.com, where you can apply. If that looks promising, then we'll do a first interview with you for about 15 minutes. And then if we're really interested from there, we'll do much deeper diligence for hopefully pretty rapid process, but just really understanding how you're thinking about things. And so, yeah, like I just said, we funded 5 teams with this model at the beginning of the year and are planning to do another roughly 5 to 8 teams in the next month or so.
So you apply if you're a scientist with a company, you get $400,000, and then you have presumably access to the teams you've gone through previously. And do you guys have any kind of community or office hours or other support you provide?
Yeah, so we do office hours with teams as often as they would like. We have teams signing up for office hours with each or multiple of us. Sometimes it's multiple times a week. Sometimes, it's just kind of a heads down phase where teams don't really need anything other than to execute on their experiments for, let's say, a month. So it might be varying touch points. But yeah, I mean, we think of it as going for roughly a year in our heads in terms of how we're doing this intensive support. Realistically, we're going to be happy to help for as long as you're working on your company, and we'll be happy to talk to you as frequently as you think would be helpful. But I think that's something else that's different than some of the other kind of really early stage support programs that are out there that are much shorter term. I think for these types of companies, a lot of the time to make research progress, it takes a lot longer than just 2 or 3 months. And so we wanted to design a model where we could be supportive with that mindset. Outside of those individual office hours, we also do group office hours with teams and or bring in speakers of, really promising other entrepreneurs or investors to talk to the group as well, to get a better sense of how to be thinking about building their companies as well. So yeah, trying to create something that's not just about the money, but even arguably more so is about the kind of support and mentorship we're creating.
You guys are providing capital and then mentorship, support, speakers, and networking, things like that. And who are you providing this for? Like what group of people did you identify as needing what you're providing?
Yeah, so usually we think of it as early career scientists, like graduate students or freshly minted PhDs or postdocs that have an idea and want to start a company. Maybe it's one person by themselves, maybe it's a team of 2 or 3 people. But yeah, someone that has an idea and thinks a company is a better format for pursuing that vector of research and translation of whatever they're working on. We'd really like to see that someone on the team has aptitude to kind of be growing into a leader over time. That doesn't mean they need to look like that right now, but we want to be funding things where it's actually going to be the founders involved running it into the long term rather than bringing in executives ideally to kind of take over just because they're supposedly more experienced. Going back to the beginning of what I was saying, we really believe in this model of actually having the technology creators and the people there from the start running things into the long term. We really want at least one person on the team to be full-time. We're pretty inflexible about that. This isn't meant to be something that's taken lightly and just done on the side. We really want you, or at least someone committed to the company very heavily. And even though I said it's meant for early career scientists at the start, very willing to consider professors or later stage scientists that think this could be a fit as well. So yeah, really that high aptitude to be a leader, good idea, and willing to take this very seriously is what we're looking for.
So this could be people like a postdoc or a grad student. They have, they're working on their grad project or whatever work they're doing their postdoc, and then they've been thinking about like a couple startup ideas with friends maybe, and sort of toying around with it and weighing, do you do this versus stay in academia versus start a company? And I feel like I have a lot of, like most of my scientist friends have some startup idea that they're thinking about doing with various degrees of seriousness. I find that a lot of them end up kind of moving a little bit forward with the idea, but not full time. And then they go and join like a venture fund or go and join a consulting company or something like that. So why would somebody who is just coming out of their PhD program, who's interested in startups, but not fully committed to it, like what's the benefit of starting a company versus doing something like staying in academia or joining a fund or joining another type of for-profit organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think you should only really be doing it if you are serious about your idea, because it's not a light undertaking. That doesn't mean you need to have it fully figured out or, feel this commitment that you're going to absolutely, no matter what, do this for 5 to 10 years. But I do think it's pretty important to have the mindset that you're going to give it a real shot for 1 to 2 years, no matter what happens. I think, sometimes just like figuring out the plan and just having the focus to figure out the plan are really important to actually getting things in shape. So if you're already looking at it as like an early exit window and just like a light thing to do, then it's probably, at least how we think about it, is probably not well aligned for that type of person. I think that said, though, it's like very okay to fail at this. I think a lot of potential founders think that it's much riskier to start a company than it actually is. I mean, obviously you have to take into account your personal life circumstances. Like everyone's different. Some people have a lot more on the line than others. But for your average, young graduate student, maybe in their mid to late 20s that, maybe doesn't have a family yet and stuff like that, like taking a risk on this, especially if you're receiving some funding for a year, is actually not that risky at all. Places like VC funds or industry jobs for that matter are going to look at you probably with more admiration for having given something like this a try, even if it failed, than if you had just done something more conventional. And even if you want to go back into academia after that, I'm sure you can get a postdoc and pick that career path back up. So yeah, I think it's important to have commitment to this, but I also think it's important, unless your circumstances are quite different, to not overthink how big of a risk this is, because it's really quite small and there's career advantages to it, even when it doesn't work out often.
Yeah, and if you're giving people, $40,000 or so, they'll be able to pay themselves a salary with part of that. And it's not like, the situation where a few years ago, if you were starting a biotech company out of your PhD, you had to either have friends who had a bunch of money or just kind of go out and get SBIR grants or whatever to fund your work. But I guess, so the risk side is one thing, like, and it does sound like now starting a company as a scientist is less risky than it used to be. But what's the flip side of that? Why would someone want to do that? Like, what's the benefit of it? Obviously there are potential financial benefits, although whether the expected value of starting a company is more or less financially lucrative than another kind of job is a question. But like beyond the financial stuff, why would somebody want to start a company?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the most compelling reasons are that if you're like a highly motivated scientist and assuming you work on something you believe could have big impact in the world, I think setting aside a realm of ideas that are like purely for curiosity, basic research that I don't think are well suited for companies, I think academia is a wonderful place for those types of things. And it's really awesome. We have a system that can support those types of ideas. But if you're working on something that you think has big translational impact, even if it's a small chance of working out, then often a company is a better format for pursuing that type of research and working on the translation. I really think there's two big bucket categories as to why that's the case. One is often these really difficult problems are very hard to do on your own or with a very small team. And I think a company is a much better system typically than an academic lab for coordinating people and resources towards a really difficult problem. Unlike in an academic environment where people are really focused on publications and first authorship, and you just got to kind of stake out your own little small fiefdom that you can work on. It's in a company, it's really easy to align everyone to work together on a difficult problem where you can set out a milestone into the future that people need to work towards. And you can have multiple people working on exactly the same problem, but different approaches. You can have support people helping the people working on different areas. And so it's just much easier to work in a coordinated fashion on difficult problems. And so I think you're more likely in a lot of these instances to actually end up making some significant discovery or making some progress on what may have seemed like an intractable problem that could take much longer period of time to solve. So that's one of the main advantages. The other really big advantage is I think it's honestly, if you're working on the right thing that's promising, it's a lot easier to get resources, both in the short term and long term, to actually translate something. We're really in a weird time in the world right now. Can't guarantee this lasts forever, but right now there's so much capital out there, private capital for investing in things. And investors increasingly are really interested in these really impactful ideas that might be more research intensive, but if they work out, can actually have a big impact on people's lives in terms of saving lives or benefiting lives somehow. And so it's really becoming more and more commonplace for even early career scientists that maybe they're a year into their company can go out and raise $5-10 million from an investor with the expectation that's all going to be basically spent towards making progress in a 1 to 2 year type of time frame. And so expecting like an early career academic lab to have access to those types of resources, I think is much less common. I think often for these types of fundraising processes, not always, but often, it's faster to do this type of fundraising than it would be going through the grant process. And that's not even to say the grant process can also be part of your consideration. There are things like, what Richard mentioned, SBIRs, STTR grants that are accessible from government. There's private foundation grants that are very interested in funding private companies. So there's just like a lot more out there in terms of financial resources that are possible in the earlier stages. And then at the later stages, when you're thinking about things like clinical trials or some of the types of things that really increase in cost over time, a company is much more likely to be able to raise, it sounds crazy now, but it happens all the time, $100 million to actually go and take something into a clinical trial properly so it can actually get translated. In an academic lab, that's much more rare. And so, there's academic labs that do research for a while and then they spin out and are able to raise in a company fashion that type of money. But I think it's also more of like a false start when you have to do that, because in a company that started from the start and is getting to that point, you're going to have the whole team there still working towards the same goal. In an academic lab that spins out, you're going to have the spin out, build a new team to really start working on progressing the research further and managing the clinical trials as well. So I think it's easier to maintain the growth momentum over time when you start everything in a company from the start too.
Yeah, and the logistics of actually getting something out of academia can obviously be pretty tricky at times. And the more valuable something becomes within an institution, then the trickier it can get to pull it out as well. But I think, your point about like the funding markets is if you think about being a 28 or something year old scientist and you're kind of thinking, what are your next steps? And you can think about moving forward in academia or starting a company. And it is a weird time now where I know people who've, before they've even incorporated a company, basically raised like $5 or $10 million
Yep.
to start a company in a matter of weeks, which is obviously an outlier. Not every company is like that, but there is the potential to raise millions of dollars to do science that is not necessarily not dissimilar from what you're doing in academia, a little bit more applied. But to do that as a fairly young scientist, and then if things go well, then you see companies like I think Mammoth and others like that have raised very significant amounts of capital to move things forward. So that's a pretty interesting phenomenon that will allow you to sort of build your own lab and do your own science with a much larger budget than you get at another time period. Now, granted, you have to work on things that are much sort of different in terms of the goals of the work, but the resources you have to do science in the private markets can be pretty significant. But I think that one of the other sort of interesting points related to that is people do hear about this stuff sometimes, or they'll have like a friend or a friend of a friend who started a company and raised a bunch of money. They'll like read in the news or see on Twitter that there's all this money flowing around, and then it can sort of develop the expectation that it's going to be easy for them to raise money. And oftentimes, if people aren't really familiar with the startup world, you can kind of have this idea that you just go out and raise money magically and you get $10 million in a few weeks. But it's definitely not that easy, for sure. And I think that having help with that process is pretty essential, because I think the best way to do it is to get people who are connected in the industry to support you. So in terms of like the fundraising process, how do you guys help founders sort of get into that world and figure out how much you need to raise and raise an effective round?
Yeah, so that's something we spend a lot of time with teams that are getting ready to fundraise, strategizing what the fundraise looks like, helping get their presentation materials together and communicating properly. And then, making introductions to investors. Across the four of us, we're pretty well connected at this point amongst Silicon Valley life science interested investors, which I think is pretty helpful. You're definitely right, though, that it's not always super easy. A lot of people that set out to do this are going to fail. If you're going to start a company, I think you should kind of set the expectation that more likely than not, it's not going to work out. A lot of growth will happen along the way. And still, as I said earlier, there's a good chance you'll end up career-wise in a better position than where you were prior. But in terms of the full company working out to your wildest dreams, or even like within the first couple of years, like there's a good chance that's not going to happen, especially in these types of companies where it's not just about willing something into existence, but you're trying to make scientific results that are promising. You can't just like automatically force that to happen. It's like, to some degree, it's exploration, and there's just fundamental scientific risk to things that are going on. So yeah, I don't want to pretend that those aspects aren't there, but I think the other good thing about these types of difficult problems is there's people like us and others out there that are going to want to try and help you, because you're actually working on something that's important to the world rather than something that's just frivolous. This isn't just like, a like Snapchat clone or something. You're likely trying to do something that could have real impact on some important problem in the world by dint of these types of scientific ideas. And so, yeah, I think it's a good thing that over time, especially as you're tenacious and trying to reach out and meet more people, there are going to be people that genuinely want to help you and can help you along the journey. You don't have to go this route by yourself.
Yeah, for sure. And I really appreciate that you guys offer that, especially because you are in the trenches as well. And I think that, like, of the academic founders that I've seen who have been successful, there's like a very, very strong correlation between like not been successful, but been successful in raising money. There's a strong correlation between the strength of their network in the VC community and the rate at which they raise funding. And I think the fact that you all kind of have those connections can help things come together a lot more quickly from a fundraising standpoint. But from the perspective of a scientist who's looking at starting a company, maybe somebody who's a little bit more serious about it, there are a lot of options now. And yeah, you have to work, harder, obviously, to raise those big rounds and make progress and do a lot of kind of more networking. But there are other options in terms of kind of incubator programs or other seed funds or capital providers. What do you feel like differentiates you guys from other sources of capital for early stage scientist founders?
Yeah, I think it's some of the things we touched on. One, like much longer mindset in terms of timelines of the companies we're working with compared to most of these programs. Two, we've actually been building life science companies ourselves. So we really understand the pretty unique experience of what that is like. I don't like to think this is a major aspect, but the funding terms compared to most of these accelerator like programs of what we're offering are a lot better. I think it's more money that's less dilutive compared to a lot of these programs out there. So yeah, I think things along those lines.
Yeah. And do you guys do like a demo day or anything like that?
At this point, we don't. We've been helping teams bespoke fundraise as they're ready in terms of making direct introductions and talking to investors for them. We're thinking about doing something like that, like a showcase day. Potentially, it wouldn't even just be for the teams we fund. I think it could be pretty cool to have something that can just generally help scientists or science companies out there with fundraising, since that can be a challenge. But yeah, we're still thinking through that at this point. And so, yeah, at this point, we're just doing the bespoke introductions for teams as they need help.
Yeah, I think that makes it. It's like, because if you have a demo day, then you sort of set a goal date for when you need to accomplish XYZ milestones. And if you're a software company, that's not as much of an issue because you can accomplish stuff on a faster time frame. But like, if your critical experiment doesn't read out for 6 months, you don't want to have to, and your demo day is in 3 months, you don't want to have to like finagle some weird milestone before the demo day.
Exactly.
You just want to be able to let the science kind of breathe and move at its own pace.
I think unfortunately that ends up happening quite a bit, that these companies that have a challenge meeting a shorter term time frame kind of shoehorn to fit the demo day, and then yeah, it really doesn't help them. Sometimes it even harms them.
Yeah, and I think even kind of for long term too, you want to make sure you do the science right for sure.
Yep.
Rather than tailor it to a demo day. But I think the problem broadly of kind of helping people raise money more effectively is definitely an interesting one. That's cool that you guys are just thinking about kind of doing a more broad kind of community-based, maybe not a demo day, but like some sort of way to help people raise funds and kind of aggregate people together and investors together.
Yeah, I think it would be a good thing. And again, it's the spirit where like the main reason we're doing this is we just want to help more science companies succeed and be examples of what's possible. Yeah, if we can do stuff like that that helps beyond the direct companies we're working with, I think it can make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I definitely come across a lot of founders who would really appreciate, as you know, who would really appreciate a service like that to kind of grease the wheels a little bit on the fundraising process. So in terms of the companies you've just funded, when was your first batch?
I think we're like 3 months into it at this point, maybe.
Okay, 3 months. So you've had 3 months of experience with them. What's the most interesting thing you guys have learned during that time frame?
So this is less of in regards to the teams we're working with, but one thing we really discovered while interviewing teams was a lot of them had messed up cap tables. A lot of them, especially when they had like part-time PIs involved or were spinning out of a PI's lab basically with their graduate research, they often felt like they had to give their PIs a lot more equity than they actually deserved. And I think it was like part of this kind of like, well, A, not really having like a appropriate benchmark about knowing what it should be, but B, kind of like feeling like, well, these people even subconsciously are kind of my boss, and I don't know how that relationship is going to evolve over time. So they'd give big chunks of equity that weren't fully warranted to the PIs. And that's something where fast forwarding with now years of experience of investing, a lot of the time that can breed resentment and just be a bad signal to investors about, how organized the company is and how, willing to kind of stand their ground the founders are in terms of being tough. So yeah, fixing cap tables was something, especially amongst teams we didn't end up funding, but were otherwise promising. Spent a lot of time helping to counsel on. In terms of things with teams we've worked with directly, it's hard to generalize. I mean, we really try and take a pretty individual approach to whatever the problems are that the teams are having. We've intentionally structured in a way where it's not like there's a lot of outside mentors that teams are interacting with, because we don't think it's that helpful when Mentors are just kind of shooting from the hip, even when they're super smart and have built super successful things. I think like having context build up over time about what a team is like is actually pretty important and useful. So we try to structure things more that way. And then in terms of how we're actually advising teams and what we're learning and what they're learning, keeping it really custom to their individual problems and circumstances.
Yep, that makes sense. And I think the point you made about the cap tables is also like, that's probably the second or third most common thing that people ask me. Is like, I have this technology, I'm in a lab right now, my PI is involved. Like, what do we do with all this? And, sometimes it is the more subconscious, like, this is your PI, your boss, there's a hierarchical structure. So, and it's his lab or her lab, and this is how it works. And then sometimes it's even more overt. Like sometimes, there can be situations where the PI may just say, this is how it works. I'm the boss. Like, I need this much equity. And that can be pretty tough to deal with sometimes when there's a dug-in stance. But it always comes out when you need to raise more money. It's a problem that in most cases needs to be addressed at some point, where you just don't have enough room on the cap table for future employees or for future investors. And, in some cases it definitely, it can work out. So the PI has a ton of equity or a large pound of equity all the way through the life of the company. But in more cases than not, I see it causes companies to sort of wither away on the vine. But you mentioned best practices. So what are the best practices you've seen for structure cap tables early on?
Yeah. Excuse me. So for this example of PIs, I think in most circumstances, there's always outliers, but in most circumstances, they shouldn't have more than 10%. And that's if they're going to actually be pretty involved. I think a lot of the time, the more appropriate amount for a PI might be anywhere from like 1% to 3%. And then I think part-time co-founders, generally speaking, whether they're PI or not, you really need to be careful about thinking about how much equity they should have. It shouldn't be at a level that's equal to the full-time founders, and should be, maybe there's a route where they can get more equity later if they're willing to commit later, but the full-time people are committing now. So they should be rewarded for committing now when there's the maximal amount of risk. That part-time heuristic, I think, of 10% can also apply for non-PI part-time people as well. Again, circumstances are custom. Maybe someone's investing their own money alongside of it too, albeit probably if we're talking about early career scientists or even PIs, it's not going to be that material of amount of money compared to what's necessary. But there's different factors in terms of what can be taken into account.
And in terms of like scientific advisory boards as well, what do you typically see for that? How do you typically structure those?
Yeah, so this you're going to hear different opinions on for sure. I'm probably kind of outlier out there, but I'm not a big believer in scientific advisory boards, especially early on, unless they're advisors that are actually actively providing a lot of value. So like if they're actually like taking time to go through experiments with you and update how you're thinking about things on a pretty regular basis, rather than just once every 6 months or something like that, then I think it can be pretty valuable. But a lot of the time people feel compelled to just add scientific advisors that are kind of famous in the field and they hope will signal to investors that, this is a serious company. And that can work with some investors, but there's a lot of investors out there that will actually look at that as like an anti-signal in terms of like, this company is not focused on what's actually most important. And they're just trying to like, look like a big kid company, so to speak, and, look like serious. I'm really not a fan of that kind of like kabuki type of aspect of things. Other people will tell you differently on that though.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, definitely there are people, there's some value potentially to adding SAB members for signaling, but that's not always the case. And you do need to be careful about kind of adverse selection related to that and structuring those. But to get back to the point about just the PI involvement in general, like, so if you are a scientist spinning out a company and you're going to be full-time on this, and the PI isn't going to be full-time or super involved, and maybe you're licensing technology from the lab, maybe not, but there is, a conversation that needs to be had to get the cap table to a point where it works for investors and employees going forward. What have you seen works in those discussions? And I'm sure it's a case by case basis, but if there's anything generally you've learned, what works in those discussions about sort of orienting around the cap table?
So you mean if you need to adjust down people if it's been set up inappropriately?
I'm talking, well, I guess that too, but I was talking more about at the outset. If you're trying to spin something out or start a company and you have, the relationships to manage and the cap table to manage, and what's the best way to go about it?
Yeah, I mean, on a lot of the topics we're talking about, I wrote a blog post on my personal website about this topic. I think you could show that as a reference in terms of different circumstances of how this can look and what seems most appropriate. Yeah, I think the reason I wrote that is I really did feel like there wasn't a lot of material out there kind of like benchmarking with what would actually be normal. People just had to kind of wade through this by themselves. But yeah, I mean, it is like a negotiation process. Basically, like you want to be treating the people you're going to be working with respect, but you also want to advocate for yourself for what is actually fair. So yeah, I mean, these are kind of tricky conversations. I think if it's at a point where you have a benevolent investor that wants to help fund starting the company, and the benevolent investor also thinks similarly about what's fair about equity, then you can use that as some of like a leverage point as well to be talking about the people you're working with or other potential investors. But yeah, I mean, this is again a circumstance where you need to feel out your own individual circumstances and make the best of them.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, yeah, and I'll link that blog post if you just send it to me after and put it down in the video description. Yeah, we've got only like 15 minutes left, so maybe we can jump into the just kind of the application and what you guys are looking for and everything. Unless is there anything else you wanted to say in terms of like why starting a company makes sense for some scientists or other general advice, learnings?
I think we've covered stuff pretty well.
Okay, so your application is August 15th. A deadline is August 15th. And what is the application? A written component and then an video interview?
Yep, written component, 15-minute interview, and then potentially follow-up questions, a follow-up interview after that if we have more questions.
And so when you see the written application, like how do you typically process it in your mind? Like what do you look for first? What gets you excited? What are the red flags?
Yeah, so we have a video on there actually. That's like I think it's a 1-minute video just asking the founders to introduce themselves. That's always helpful to hear the founders introducing things in their own words as starting to read through. But yeah, looking for people that can communicate pretty clearly and concisely. People that seem to have thought well through their idea about how to develop, even if it's just an idea stage. Also, yeah, people that have some degree of tenacity or something impressive about them that would make us think these people are worth kind of betting on that they're going to be able to produce something successful.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of just focus on the people, their communication skills, the trying to get the determination that you need. What about the idea? Do you guys think about that as much, or is it really just kind of let's focus on the people and then get into the idea, the interview?
Yeah, we try to be pretty agnostic about ideas. Obviously, the four of us are all coming from different backgrounds where we have things we're more interested in than others, but we try and actually ignore that as much as we can and just more focus on the people. I really think a lot of the time, the most interesting things kind of come from out there places rather than what is conventionally deemed to be in vogue or really promising at any given time point. And so, yeah, we want to be supporting the kind of weirder out there things as well. And yeah, we're really willing to consider anything, even things that are like, even things that are non-life science, we're willing to take a look at. I can't promise we'll be able to be as helpful, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there that can't get properly supported otherwise right now, where scientists need a hand there too, and we're happy to try. And tools that help researchers or scientists or scientific companies do what they're doing, we're excited about too. Actually, one of the 5 companies fit that mold where it's actually like a software company. It's like a lab collaboration tool to help both startup labs and then academic labs be able to do their research more effectively. the team is a software engineer and a professor at UCLA that went on sabbatical to focus on this. Yeah, we're willing to consider stuff like that too.
Yeah, you guys have a pretty diverse set of companies in the first. You've got like some drug companies, that software company, you've got like one or two med device companies as well.
Yep.
And then, yeah, like you said, like Nish founded Color Genomics, which is more of a genetics company. I guess Mammoth is sort of diagnostics and therapeutics. And then Ovid is, not sure how would you classify Ovid, but it's definitely a very interesting and kind of non-traditional life sciences idea. So I kind of get that you guys are kind of looking for companies like that, right? Like, well, not necessarily just like that, but you're excited to see a company that may not fit a pre-existing, but is more interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, I think that's right. We're not opposed to these things, but generally probably less excited about something that's like, okay, like a single small molecule asset that seems promising and now want to take it through trials. I think there might be better playbook type things for that, although we're willing to take a look too if you think we can be helpful.
Yeah. And so it's what gets your attention in an application? You mentioned that clear and concise communication and seeing some evidence of determination. Those are things that you need to see to move. But if you think about maybe one or two standout applications that you read, what was it that really got your interest?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of people, this doesn't exactly answer your question, but a lot of people work on ideas that are like somewhat similar, or like it's probably discernible that there's other people out there working on something very similar. And I think in those types of cases, it's worth trying to articulate, why what you're doing is actually special. Like, for example, if you have some bioinformatics platform to make it easier to analyze single cell RNA sequence data, like last time we got like 10 applications for an idea like that. So why is your approach actually special, or what are you actually going to do to get traction more effectively than other people? That would be an example to think about. Yeah, generally though, I mean, we're pretty liberal about doing interviews. We received about 400 applications last time, and we did 100 first round interviews.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, I mean, I do think it's much more granular to actually be able to have person-to-person contact and like a conversation around this type of stuff. So if you can communicate pretty clearly and your idea seems sound, and you're generally like a pretty well put together person, then we'll probably want to talk to you.
Got it. So that sounds really interesting. So you basically, I mean, your application process, the written part is fairly short, I would imagine. You've got the video and then kind of a written component. And then you have like a fairly high percentage chance of getting an interview. And then that interview gives you the chance to, get to the $400,000 investment in a pretty short time period. So that seems like a pretty compelling position to be in. Like if you're a scientist, like the odds seem to be pretty attractive.
Yeah.
So where is the application? It's on your website?
Yep, SciFounders.com.
Okay. So I'll put that in the description as well. And then, so you mentioned you're looking for even idea stage founders, kind of scientists, technical founders looking to start a company. Is there anything else in terms of the kind of founders you're looking for? Geographically, background, anything else?
We're willing to fund people anywhere. Like we have one team that's in the UK. Haven't funded anything so far in the Bay Area, even though we're all here. So yeah, really open to geographic diversity. Trying to think if anything else. Yeah, can be further than idea stage too. Like you can have proof of concept stuff or some semblance of the technology developed. If you need to be licensing stuff from the university, we're happy to help with that. Yeah. And yeah, if we fund you, I mean, the money we give you can be used any way you want. We're really not going to kind of keep tabs on it. It's up to you.
And do you have to be incorporated to apply?
No, we can help you get incorporated. And yeah, if you end up needing more money than the 400K too from early on, we're happy to help you find more funding from other sources. Like there's one team, for example, that it was obvious from the start they would need more. And so we kind of jumped into planning around that. So yeah, don't think like this needs to be the end of the resources as well. Again, part of what we're doing here beyond just the funding is the mentorship aspects that we think we can really help early career scientists that are new to this type of thing be more likely to succeed.
And you accept solo founders and teams as well? Is there any, like, is 5 people too much? 4 people, 6 people?
Yeah, I'm honestly always a little skeptical when there's 4 or more, with
Yeah.
increasing amounts of skepticism with each incremental person.
Okay. So if you're a sort of a mid to early career scientist who wants to start a company, whether you've done it or not, whether you've licensed technology or not, if you're a solo founder or a group of people, then you can apply to SciFounder. You've got a short written application. A lot of people who do the written application get the video interview, and then you select a handful, give them $400,000 as an investment, and potentially help them raise more. And then, yeah, it's also just kind of doing my head. You have a very high or low ratio of or high ratio of mentors to companies. So there's 3 of you guys or 4 of you guys who are full time, and then you had 5 companies. So
You're not,
or not full time, but 4 who are like on the core team. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, and 2 of you are actively building startups now, C-level at startups, and then I don't know if Nish is starting anything now, but so basically, if you get accepted to the batch, there's going to be a handful of other people in your batch, the people from the batch beforehand, and then you guys as the core team being able to provide kind of hands-on mentorship.
Yep, that's right.
Okay. Yeah, well, I would definitely encourage anybody who fits that category to apply. Personally, obviously, think that starting a company is an attractive option to a lot more people than who currently consider it. It's definitely not the right path for most people, I would say. But for a subset of people who it is the right path for, it's like you can't really do anything else. I feel like if you do go work at a fund or work at a big company, it's just not going to be the same as if you started your own company. And yeah, you guys provide a very, very interesting, very unique offering in terms of funding and support. And I think that, if you're a founder, it doesn't make sense to not apply if you fit the right stage. So yeah, I'll put the link to all your information. Yeah, so many of the blog posts you want to link, I'll link to the application as well. Anything else you want to say in closing here?
I don't think so. I think we covered it pretty well. Yeah, thanks for chatting with me, Richard. This was fun.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining. And everyone else, if you want to apply to SciFounder, I'll put the links in the description below. But yeah, thanks again, Matt. This was fun.